So, Daniel Grimwood,
Hi.
this is your first visit to my crazy house here,
I love it.
and you gave a wonderful recital on Sunday
Thank you very much.
to another packed house of our wonderful friendly audience. But you chose a very highly original programme. What lay behind those choices that you made?
Well, I think starting off with the Schumann pairing, I do quite like to play Robert and Clara next to each other, and
Mr. and Mrs.
I think they would have enjoyed the idea as well. I think that the arabesque is a really beautiful way to introduce yourself to an audience and sort of open the space. Schumann had this, like all pianists did in the 19th century, he improvised, and it was said that when he came across an idea that he particularly liked, he'd just repeat it over and over and over again. And you find that in some of his piano music, some fragments where you think, oh yeah, I like that. And the arabesque is one of these pieces where there's quite a lot of repetitions, and it gives the performer a lot of ways to sort of dream it in a new way each time it comes back.
Yeah.
So it sort of relaxes the player into a concert.
Kind of add a slightly different seasoning each time it returns, so that we're drooling and anticipating the next one and wondering what nuance.
Were you drooling?
I was actually.
Oh, that's nice.
I hope not too visibly. It was a beautiful performance. And the Clara Schumann piece.
Oh, it's magnificent. I mean, I think, she was, obviously one of the greatest pianists of her 100 years. And again, as all pianists did improvise, I think that piece in particular gives you, with its very subtle arabesques, gives you a clue as to how she might have sounded when she was ornamenting melodies.
And you spoke in your introduction at the concert of the pieces being like love letters to each other. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, we know that there are a lot of references to Clara. I think that's probably in one direction. I think that's Robert to Clara. And she was quite a fair bit his junior, of course. But that he poured out his love into his compositions, particularly through those years where they were unable to see each other.
Because of Clara's father not liking the relationship.
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably quite understandably.
Yeah, possibly, knowing what Robert's slightly unstable personality
It is bonkers, yeah.
Aren't we all? In terms of quality, though, I mean, this is a time of promotion for many female composers, which is a very good thing. How would you, well, perhaps it's unfair to rate them at all, but how would you compare the quality of Clara's music to that of Robert?
I think there are some difficult things to pick apart here. I actually normally resist talking about this. In fact, there was a concert where I was playing, I think, Fanny Mendelssohn, and the promoter said, would you like to talk about the fact that she was a female composer? And I said, no, I don't. I think if there's a child in the audience, I don't want to be the person that puts it into their heads that there's something novel about this. I think we ought to have passed beyond that. But let's talk about it for a second anyway. So there were different roles. We know that male and female pianists probably performed quite differently from each other. There was just different roles. And I think that Clara herself wasn't necessarily always very comfortable with encroaching on a role that she didn't feel that she belonged in. And I think it can be, it's complicated. It's quite easy to conflate misogyny and sexism. The 19th century was a very sexist place, but it wasn't necessarily a misogynistic place. It was just that they fulfilled different roles. And I think the same is possibly true of the compositions. I don't. There's a lack of grand orchestral works that were written by women. This isn't because they were incapable. I think certainly Fanny Mendelssohn would have loved to have written larger scale works, but the opportunity simply didn't exist. It wasn't there. So I think the other thing that I always think about was that a lot of the music was written without a fair proof being provided for a publisher. So we're often given pieces of music that aren't necessarily absolutely complete. So that can be quite stimulating from the performer's point of view, to think, right, how do I animate this and give it what the composer deserves? Then you move later on into the 20th century, and I think of Doreen Carwithen, for example, whose the beginning of her career was so promising. She was performed at the BBC proms, but no publishers would take her on. And if you're not going to get published, you can't make a living from composition. So her career was very, very short, and she merited and deserved better. And I think that the same is this hidden history that's now coming to light, thank God, of all of these composers who just didn't receive the publicity that their talents merited.
And yet,
it's a great shame.
Their composer husbands, Robert Schumann, Gustav Mahler, as well as Doreen Carwithen's husband, William Alwyn. They did achieve success, which is, it speaks of very clear priorities, doesn't it? That my work is more important than yours.
I think it's when you see photographs of Alwyn and Carwithen, you think they look not dissimilar to photos of my grandparents.
Oh, really?
And I think that sort of brings home that this is really quite recent.
Yes.
It's been really recent that it's been possible for women to make a career.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. In my childhood, the woman was the homemaker, and that was that.
Yeah.
It was assumed that was that. What about in terms of her piano playing career? Did she suffer sexism or prejudice in that at all?
I'm not really a specialist in this, but I think that she was... she must have been an absolutely captivating performer in order to cut through all of that. Nobody really questions her importance, it seems. And there were a handful of figures in the 19th century who really did have big careers. Sophie Mentor being the other, who was, interestingly, I believe, criticised during her lifetime for being too masculine at the piano. That sort of goes back to what I was talking about, men and women having different roles as performers. She performed probably rather more than she would have liked to have done because she had to, with all those children to raise and stuff. It beggars belief how she was able to actually fulfill all of the roles that she did in her life. What an extraordinarily industrious individual she must have been.
You're a specialist in performance practice in the 19th century. What do we know about her playing, her style of playing, if anything?
Well, there's a lot of evidence because, of course, quite a lot of her students recorded and left quite detailed memoirs of what she was like as a teacher, quite severe. But what always interests me is we think of her as being sort of a piano teacher full of strictures, and then you listen to her students and they're playing in this sort of wild, fabulous, improvisatory way, and you think, well, if that was the case, what does it say about the others?
Yeah.
And I that really interests me. There was the figure of Metelka Freund, who studied with her, who knew Brahms when she was a young girl and was, very admired by him. And then she did what many women do, got married and had children, but at that time that was the end of her performing career. But she returned to the stage in later life, and what was interesting about that was that she didn't modernise. So her playing, we can assume, was exactly as it had been stylistically when she was young. So that being a pianist that Brahms admired, who studied with Clara Schumann, tells us an awful lot.
Yes. Yeah, because although things might evolve, they're not going to radically change. There's going to be
no, and I think what happens
tradition.
What happens with a lot of performing musicians quite naturally is that our styles alter according to fashion. We evolve with the progress of music. So every now and then you have a pianist who acts like a sort of time capsule.